Welcome to this edition of Real World Employment Law, where we address real-world issues impacting businesses and executives. My name is Nick Johnson. I'm a partner here at Barron's Weig Leonard, and I work in our firm's employment practice. I'm excited today because we have a special guest here with us today in studio that I'd like to introduce for an important topic that we're talking. We have Kaamil Khan, president of Makpar Corporation. Kaamil, great to have you here. Tell us a little bit about yourself and your company.
Thank you, Nick. Yes, Makpar is a small business specializing in cloud, cybersecurity, and data. Main federal agencies we support are the IRS, Department of Interior, and Department of Labor. So excited to be here today. I mean, this is a big, important topic in our industry right now.
And Kaamil, well, I'm really excited that you're here. I see that you're here wearing a Virginia Tech pin. You're coming in here in my territory, in our office, as a Clemson guy, throwing the Virginia Tech flag out there. Even though that, you know what, I think we're going to have a good discussion.
But, your better half did also go to Virginia Tech, so much smarter and better looking than you, is all I can say.
You have me there. You have me there. And you know what? It reminds me of when we very first met together, when we worked together on the Fairfax Young Lawyers Board many years ago. We had fewer gray hairs back then. But you know what? It's
fewer gray hairs, fewer the COVID-15. I'm still trying to get rid of that. But no, it's been a long time since actually I was in your conference room. I was like, we used to have our meetings there.
Yes, yes.
So, yeah, long time coming.
Absolutely. Well, happy to have you here in studio. We're talking about an issue that's really important. That's certainly front and center with this administration, and also just front and center with, I think, businesses in general. And that's artificial intelligence. And specifically what we're talking about today is how companies can properly create and implement effective AI policies in their workplace. And Kaamil, I think one of the things that I think sparked the idea that you and I had to kind of get this podcast together was there was a stat that you and I were talking about that we came across that I actually find quite jarring. And specifically, there was a recent survey conducted about workplaces across the country, and it was surveying workplace trend and kind of what's going on in the workplace. And one of the most noteworthy stats in that survey was that 75% of employees are using AI in the workplace. And so the question of, are people using AI? I mean, that's no longer. People are absolutely using AI in the workplace. It's happening. I mean, as a business owner yourself, how does that stat make you feel?
It's the reality of the situation. AI is here, and I think that's what's fascinating about AI. It's like the wild, wild west of technology. Law and policy are just kind of catch up. I mean, the way it exploded and the way it's kind of come in, everyone's using it, right? I saw an article that Gen Z doesn't make a major decision without checking with their ChatGPT bots. I mean, it's fascinating to me. And, and actually you forgot to mention the most important part about that. 70% are using it. 78% are doing it without an AI policy. And that's when I was like, oh, Nick, how do we start drafting
That's
an
pretty
AI
scary,
policy?
Yeah. And so to kind of unpack that a little bit. So approximately 75% of employees are using artificial intelligence in the workplace. And of those 75%, close to 80% are doing it without authorization, without an AI policy, kind of either bringing in AI on their own. And so as a business owner, I mean, without proper guardrails, that can be somewhat scary. And so, I mean, I think, what we're seeing on the legal side is certainly you have this proliferation of the use of AI in the workplace. On the legal side, you see this administration really promoting the use of artificial intelligence as well. I mean, and you saw it as one of this administration's #1 priorities. I believe it was actually on Inauguration Day.
Yeah.
President Trump rescinded the prior administration's regulations on the use of artificial intelligence. Under the Biden administration, there were executive orders that, really what I would say had guardrails somewhat on saying, okay, we recognize that AI is a valuable tool, but here's some guardrails, here are some limitations that we have. The Trump administration immediately rescinded that. They entered their own executive order, really encouraging the use of artificial intelligence. I think you're also seeing around other agencies, you're seeing the deregulation of artificial intelligence. I mean, specifically, you look at the EEOC. Mm-hmm. The EEOC, they used to have technical guidance on how artificial intelligence plays into disability discrimination claims. you're not going to find that guidance anymore on the EEOC webpage. They've since taken that down. You've seen similar actions taken with the Department of Labor. What I also find really interesting is you see OMB issuing regulations and guidance memos, really encouraging the use of government officials utilizing AI. And so it's very much a part of the government contracting landscape. It's a priority of this administration. I mean, tell us a little bit why you think that is. I mean, clearly there's some benefits of AI. Why do you think this administration's prioritizing AI so much?
Well, if you want the short answer, it is. I do think the Trump administration wants American AI to be the standard for all AI platforms kind of moving forward, definitely with our race against China. And I think that's something that not only our industry, but all of America can get behind as well. The other thing is, I think this administration, especially coming in with so many technologists they brought in under the DOGE initiative, they're a little bit more willing. There's a little bit more of an appetite for risks, right? And so hopefully, that appetite to take a little bit of risk, to put a little bit of investment in, kind of take charge. I think it's exciting. It's an opportunity, and we'll see. But again, just because the guardrails aren't there, doesn't mean we can't just use this AI for any purpose, right? It's got to be the right use case. It's got to be the right data. There's still some things we have to do in order to use it properly, and that's why we started talking about possibly, creating an AI policy.
Right. And I think, we could talk about the benefits. I think the benefits of AI kind of speak for themselves.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
There's certainly a whole universe of risks associated with utilizing AI, and we should maybe talk about that. I mean, I think we already talked about, okay, we know employees are using artificial intelligence. We know there's a large number of those same employees that are using it without authorization. I mean, when I think about the risks of AI, I mean, as an attorney, there's a handful of things that jump out at me. I mean, first, confidentiality concerns. I think business owners need to be thinking about, okay, if my employees are utilizing an AI tool in their work and kind of deliverables that we're providing, I'm really nervous about ensuring that sensitive company information's not being used in there. And so, I think, one of the hallmarks that you think about is, companies obviously they go to great lengths, great measures to protect their confidential information, their trade secret information. And one of the elements of establishing that is that it's generally not known, not publicly available. Well, if you have employees inputting sensitive confidential information into an AI tool, that could destroy its trade secret status, its confidential status. And so that's one of the things I think that you really need to be careful of when employees are utilizing AI. Another interesting topic that I think is very unsettled is ownership, right? Mm-hmm. Is, okay, you got the situation where someone inputs information into an AI tool and then it spits out a work product. Who owns that? It's a fascinating issue.
Well, so and thanks to my colleague Graham Ryan, my friend from law school, who actually pointed me to the Copyright Office. Actually issued some guidance on use of AI in the phase of copyright. Obviously, there's going to be more with patents and other things like that we're waiting for. But again, the key element from that guidance from the Copyright Office is human intervention still has to be required. So, for example, when I wrote my award-winning Voyagers Talks for the Voyagers program, our skit that we did, I did use AI. But, it was back and forth. We took some ideas. We rewrote it. I think that would be copyright protection. You see a lot of folks on the internet who are using AI to create a lot of pictures, memes. The Copyright Office guidance was very clear that just putting in prompts and kind of doing a little bit of changing there, that's not enough by itself. So, where's obviously human intervention is the standard, but what's the gray line, right? And that's what we're always going to be so close by. Eventually, we're going to get to the point where you can upload some data, create some analysis, you can create recommendations. You can even maybe possibly create written material, these are my characters, this is my world, this is the scene I want you to create. What is the line where the protections stop? And we're starting to see already on the internet these videos, right, that are popping up.
That's right. Yeah. So, I think the Copyright Office, that was some very helpful guidance, basically saying, listen, human authorship and some degree of originality, creativity is still required. Yeah. And so that helped. But I think, you're also, if you actually look at these AI providers at their own terms of use,
Yeah.
they take their own stab on who owns it. And so, OpenAI, if you actually go to their terms of use right now, I mean, now they can change those at their discretion.
It's unilateral.
Right. But if you look at it today, it says that users of OpenAI, that they own both the input and they own the output, and that OpenAI basically assigns all right and title to it. And so if you're just looking at the terms of use, which I think every business owner, if you're going to be permitting employees to use AI, you need to know what platforms they're using, and you need to look at their terms of use, because you need to see how those terms of use say who owns what. But at least when we're talking about OpenAI, they say, hey, you own it. Now, just because OpenAI says you own the input and the output doesn't necessarily mean that how they came up with the output and wherever they pulled that data from, whatever algorithm they used, that some other person, some other third party may not claim ownership to it. So I think ownership of AI output is certainly something that's unsettled. We are on the front lines of that. We're going to be seeing developments in the courts about this. We're seeing guidance coming out from government agencies. I think ownership is a big issue.
So actually, let me ask you a quick question, Nick. They did say inputs, outputs are owned by the user.
Yeah.
Notice they didn't mention analysis, right? And
Right.
the analysis is the secret sauce to AI.
The
And
algorithm, yeah.
honestly, I've been trying to learn a little bit, how does this AI generative stuff, because it's all predictions, right? It's all based on your prompt. If I put in a negative prompt, it's going to kind of agree with me and give me a negative answer. If I give a positive prompt, it is, right? The analysis is the magic behind it, and who knows what's happening to our input that's being generated into this output, and how that's being used for future models or for future purposes as well.
Right. And I think, not only that, but I think, verifying the output that comes out too.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's this new phrase that it's AI hallucinations.
Yeah.
And I think it's something that, if you're going to be using AI in the workplace, you need to be aware of what that is. And so a hallucination, basically it's false or inaccurate output. And you're actually seeing some really scary real world examples of people utilizing AI, not checking it, not having a human component kind of overseeing or supervising or reviewing it in some fashion, and kind of putting it off as their own, and it's wrong. In the legal industry, there's been some really scary cases out there where you have attorneys who have used AI to generate briefs or to generate arguments in response to a written legal brief. And kind of for those non-lawyers out there, when you're submitting a brief to a court, courts generally they rely on precedent. And one of the jobs of an attorney is you need to do your research, you need to find authority that kind of supports your position. And that's what you and I, spend a lot of our time, or I should say in your former life, spent a lot of time on Westlaw.
That's why I hire you now, Nick.
But you spend a lot of time finding cases that support your argument.
Yeah.
And now you're seeing cases where attorneys use AI to generate their responses. They submit them to the court. The court looked at these briefs, and the cases that AI spit out were completely made up, non-existent. And there's threats of sanctions. And so it's pretty scary, these AI hallucinations. You're now starting to see, courts require that if you use AI in your research, in your brief writing, you need to disclose it. And so I think, being mindful of those hallucinations and kind of verifying, taking an extra step that if you're going to use AI, maybe check your work before you submit it.
Well, remember there's that really famous case from, I think, New York, or it was some federal court case. I forget the exact jurisdiction. It was one of the first ones we heard. But the attorney was notified these cases weren't real. And so he went back to AI and said, are these real cases? And it generated these actual looking cases. I mean, that was very early on, obviously, in AI. That was really when it was just predicting, because, again, it was just trying to give you what you wanted. But it's shocking there. We had a very similar thing in GovCon recently with the GAO. Forget the exact case, Raven something, but a person, a company owner represented themselves in a protest, and rightfully so. Protests can be expensive, so they're trying to do it in front of GAO, and they used AI to generate their arguments and their brief. Unfortunately, some of the cases that were cited, that owner unfortunately missed it. It was they were they were made up, they were hallucinated.
Wow.
And so while GAO didn't sanction the person, did take it as an opportunity to call that out, and I think it's put all of the protest industry on notice that this isn't going to be allowed anymore. This was the one gimme. Now everyone has to double and triple check their citations.
I think verifying the AI tools. I mean, I see it on the ADA side as well, where if you're using an AI tool in, let's just say, hiring, you could have disability issues if you have this AI policy that's unlawfully screening out applicants. And so what does that look like? And so let's just say, you use an AI tool to help you with recruitment and maybe just screen out applicants or help with kind of hiring. And let's say that tool, even though it has facially neutral intentions, maybe it's unlawfully screening out candidates who are of a protected class. And one example that the EEOC has mentioned is what happens if your AI tool is screening out applicants who have a significant gap in employment. On its face, maybe that doesn't really mean much, but if in reality that is screening out individuals who have an employment gap because of some disability, you're going to have what's called a disparate impact claim. And so disparate impact, very different than disparate treatment. Disparate impact is where you have basically a facially neutral policy that has a disproportionate impact on some protected class, whether it's individuals with disabilities, gender, race, what have you. And so I think if you're going to be using AI in employment, you need to be mindful of some of the issues that there may be, and you really need to audit your tool a little bit. I think it is worth mentioning while we're talking about disparate impact that this administration did recently issue an executive order essentially deprioritizing, is what I would say, disparate impact claims. Disparate impact claims are still recognized under Title VII, and unless and until Congress amends Title VII, disparate impact claims will still exist. But there was a recent executive order that essentially deprioritized disparate impact claims. But so I do think, as you're kind of evaluating AI tools in the workplace, thinking about how you're using those in hiring is certainly something to consider.
Yeah, no, and I'm sure a lot of folks are going to be using it in, like you said, disparate treatment, probably with layoffs and reductions in force. How do you avoid that? Again, it's an untold area of the law, and again, if we don't understand the analysis, it's hard.
Yeah. Yeah, and so what I find kind of fascinating is we talked at the beginning about what's going on the federal side, and really the federal government is really trying to promote the use of AI to be a leader in innovation, to be a leader in creativity. And you're seeing this, just massive deregulation of artificial intelligence on the federal government side. You kind of see this diverging perspective on the state level. And so on the federal side, there's a lot of deregulation. On the state level, you're seeing the opposite. You're seeing a lot of state legislatures implement laws that regulate the use of artificial intelligence in employment. And so specifically, Illinois recently passed a law that requires companies to notify applicants, to notify employees if artificial intelligence is used in the hiring or in the screening process. New York City passed a significant law that requires annual independent bias audits of any artificial intelligence laws. Colorado passed a similar law, and states like Virginia, Texas, and Maryland all have proposed legislation on the books. And so while you're seeing a really scaled back approach on the federal side, on the state side, they're ramping up legislation. It's very much a regulatory environment. And so just because the federal government is kind of easing restrictions doesn't mean that you need to kind of overlook what's going on the state side, because they're very much kind of prioritizing this on the state level. Yeah, no,
it's fascinating. Again, right? We always see that whenever the federal government chooses not to regulate an area, states step in. And who knows what kind of law California will pass,
Right.
And then I think what's also fascinating then is especially with remote companies, if you have an employee there, what portion of the law applies to you, right? Just because you have a single employee there, because again, there's not a lot of clarity on that. These laws are written unfortunately written very broadly, and so there's not a lot of clarity.
It's not very clear. You're absolutely right.
And then I think the best example would be, both of us being college football fans, as we set up, is the name, image, and likeness situation. I know Virginia was the first state to release a statewide NIL law, which was supposed to be a recruiting advantage for local schools such as Virginia Tech. But I think the conferences are not happy about that, right? Because it's supposed to be, and again, since there's no federal standard, we're going to end up with these piecemeal,
descriptive policies. You're definitely hearing rumors and calls for kind of a federal standard. Nothing is, there's no specifics out there yet, but there's certainly rumblings that there could be some, federal standard, but nothing's kind of been formalized just yet. There is one thing when we talk about risks, there's this phrase that I keep hearing about shadow AI. What is that?
Shadow AI is basically the use of unauthorized AI platforms. But, what are you using it for? Again, it rose from shadow IT. And why did shadow IT come about? Because the current IT systems were not efficient or were missing some sort of gap. And so shadow IT was created to kind of fit that gap, right? So shadow AI, same thing. And right now, shadow AI could be just using AI platforms because there isn't a clear policy. Or if you're only authorized to using ChatGPT Enterprise, you're using Claude. That's shadow AI. But I think the risk with shadow AI is, again, like you said, proprietary information, for those defense contractors who are building sophisticated machinery, sophisticated defense infrastructure, putting their data in because you're trying to generate a report. Suddenly, that data, yes, it's in your out report, but who knows where else that data may have gone to. Insider threat, I think, is going to be very common. People putting in their, some of their inside common information that may make, companies vulnerable from an insider threat perspective. Certain business information, identity information. Again, just trying to do their work, not realizing what the risks are. And I think that's what the biggest risk about AI is. Everyone's using it without fully understanding, what the implications can be.
Yeah. So we talked at length about the risks of using AI, and I think we could probably keep going on about the risks.
Yeah.
But I mean, okay, so you're a business owner, right? You clearly see the value in your employees utilizing artificial intelligence. You want to balance the very real risks that are there. What are you supposed to do as a business owner?
Well, obviously work with you to draft an AI policy, right? Like we're starting now. But no, so again, I was talking to my vice president of technology, Jessica Alfaro, and my IT manager, Tim Lindo. And so, I was telling them, look, we need to, we're not, I know that there's a lot of talk in Silicon Valley about AI replacing people. That's not our model, right? We want to use AI to enhance our employees' productivity, really be able to do more. And so, and I talked to him about it, is, look, we want to create effective green zones, right, where our employees can use AI to experiment with. Because as part of the prep for this podcast, I was reading an IBM survey where they interviewed CEOs, and a lot of the CEOs are saying AI is not necessarily, the investment in AI is not necessarily paying off now, but they're expecting in 2 years. I think 2 years is too long. I think we'll see it, definitely in a year, we'll see a huge advancement in it, I would say. But part of it is it's like a fear of FOMO, right? You have to start now in order to get to it. So when I was showing him like kind of the initial draft policy that you and I created that I thought was, perfect, right? They traded it like it was the Apple terms of service. They're like, everyone's supposed to agree to this? How do we enforce it? And that's actually when I came back to you. I was like, look, we can write this policy in black and white. But how am I really supposed to work with these folks to help effectively implement and monitor it?
Right.
And that's where we started this.
Well, and that's the interesting thing is, I mean, I think obviously, if you're a business owner and you recognize, okay, hey, I want to encourage my people to use artificial intelligence. Okay, probably the best place to start is put together an AI usage policy. And so, okay, what's included in there? I think you're going to want to identify, okay, here are certain platforms that are permitted, preferably at enterprise level. Here are certain prohibited platforms. You see that there are certain platforms that are just banned in certain states. DeepSeek was recently banned in Virginia, banned in a number of other states. So you're going to want to make that very clear. Hey, you're not supposed to use certain platforms. I think one of the big things too is you're going to want to identify, what is the permissible scope and use of artificial intelligence, and how do you want your employees to use this? Spelling out, okay, hey, you can use it for, helping with putting together agendas and summarizing meetings. But you know what? If you're going to be using it to kind of prepare something for a client, we may want to think a little bit differently about that. I think you're also going to want to have guardrails in terms of, what's prohibited. I think certainly, based on what we were talking about before, you're going to want to prohibit employees from inputting confidential, sensitive information into an AI platform. You're certainly going to want to prohibit, the input of personnel information, employee information, socials, names, things like that.
Absolutely.
It should really be more of an aid. And so I think, putting those guardrails in there. I think, putting in some ownership provisions, making that clear, putting in a work for hire would probably help. But, you can have, the best policy in the world, but when it comes to actually enforcing that policy and monitoring that, where do you start?
So again, we are going to have the best policy in the world because I'm working with Barron's McLeonard, right? Make sure you put that discount on my invoice, please. No, again, yeah, we'll have the policy, but then it's working with, our IT team is who I'm going to be tasking with implementing this. And so working with them, right? So we're evaluating all the platforms and obviously reading the terms of service is a big part, but looking at the administrative panel, what type of monitoring can we put in there? I mean, I know it for a fact we have to monitor prompts, right? Because there are going to be certain keywords that we have to do in order to kind of establish context guardrails. I know Jessica has already started and Tim have done kind of an initial knowledge share. These are just some AI best practices, not using your company name, making sure you, don't even put your personal information in there, right? Putting in some generic information that you change in later, those types of things. So yeah, obviously monitoring the prompts, monitoring, kind of creating some trigger words so we can kind of keep some context guardrails. And then the thing that we're really going to be trying to figure out is how do we actually test what these outputs are and kind of verify the outputs and just make sure. Again, one thing that we've talked about is, again, I want our folks to use AI and know they're allowed to use AI and not really have to always run it up the flag chain, right?
Sure.
We don't want to create this bureaucracy of, can I use it for this purposes? Can I use it for that purposes? So I know you and I have talked about, let's create like low risk, medium risk, high risk, right? And try to get as much, keep the list a little bit illustrative, not exclusive, and but yeah, low risk, medium risk, know what you're doing with those, but go at it, right? You'll have it. And so but then we get to the HR things. So, are you evaluating your team for performance? I think that's kind of high risk, right? Because again, it's personal information. There could be different factors why one person is outperforming another. But once you've decided that an employee needs to be given some guidance on how to improve, creation of a PIP, I think that can be medium risk as long as you're not using the person's name and keeping some things like maybe sensitive things about the project they're on without putting it in there, putting a generic placeholder there and filling in after once you copy that data over. Right. Writing emails, agendas, that's all stuff that we want them to do, right? How do you do this a little bit faster, a little bit more productive, making it easier and readable? Don't come across as passive aggressive. Those types of things are things that we want them to improve. How do you improve? Then we get to proposals, which is a big piece of why I started having this. That is tricky. You want them to use it to improve writing, but you don't want to give away your past performance. You don't want to give away your secret solutions. And so it's like, how do you do that in that guardrail?
Right. That's
where we're really exploring it, and that's where we'll need a little bit of experimentation.
And I think it's a good starting point. I always view AI as a really good starting point. It should not be the you put it in, whatever comes out, that's it. You don't
accept it.
There absolutely, in my opinion, needs to be a human element to ensure the responsible use of artificial intelligence. And I think, when we were talking about enforcement and monitoring, I think there's other things that you can do. You can ban certain websites. I think, when you're considering an AI tool, make sure, like you said, that you can kind of monitor the search history. Make sure that you can monitor and, regulate, the input. And I think the tools are that sophisticated that you can kind of do that now. And so I think having the ability to audit your AI tool is critical because that's where you find, companies and individuals kind of getting themselves into hot waters when they just trust that the AI solution is going to kind of solve their problem for them. And so I think having a legitimate audit where it's done kind of on a regular basis, at least once a year, probably more. And then I think the biggest thing too is along your lines of, along the lines of encouraging employees to do this, train your employees on the use of AI. And so, don't just say you can use it. Actually, set aside some time and do a demo. Show them, hey, here's a real world example of how we can utilize AI to be more efficient, to be more innovative, to be more creative and set ourselves apart.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think training, people process technologies, right? The basic for any sort of technology implementation. And people are going to be your biggest they're obviously your end users, but they're also your biggest weakness in this equation, right? You can do all the evaluation of the platforms, you can set up your monitoring tools, but if your people aren't using it properly, that's where you're going to create your weakness. It's just like cyber.
Yeah.
You have all these monitoring tools, but people still end up falling for phishing attacks, social engineering. How do you? That's going to again, we try to do security awareness training yearly. I think we're going to have to shift over to incorporating AI maybe every 6 months because it changes so quickly.
Sure. Yeah.
And that's something we're discussing as well.
Yeah. Well, Kaamil, this was a really exciting topic, certainly one that we're just scratching the surface on. Really enjoyed having you in studio. We're going to have to do this again. Next time I'll have my Clemson pen on.
Well, no, thank you for having me, Nick. I had a great experience.
Thanks for tuning in.